Notre dernier intervenant est Chimère
now
Diaw.
hear from our last speaker, Chimère Diaw. So we wanted to open up the panel, as you can see, to bring in people who are not those who are just sitting behind computers, writing more or less intelligent things, and to bring here today someone who is a real practitioner as well as an excellent theorist, but he's also a practitioner, Chimère Diaw. He's the general director of the African Model Forest Network, PhD in economic anthropology, and also with diplomas in sociology. Now, he's led several international programs in the area of the environment, working on biodiversity, fishing, rural modes of life, and his specialty, which is forest management. So what is a model forest? Well, as the name suggests, these are forests that set the example in terms of governance and management of rare resources, including wood and other resources, and function in an innovative way socially and politically. In other words, for those of you who listen to France Inter in the morning, forests are really a part of this other economy, alternate economy that Bernard Maris often talked about on that radio show. But it was at 6:45 in the morning. So Diaw works particularly in Cameroon, but also Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and Congo. So the approach of this organization is particularly interesting because it opens to other sciences. So there's not only the economy, but also the natural sciences and managing biodiversity and to optimize these resources. Bernard Maris was really a front runner in the environmental issues. He ran with the Green Party. In fact, he also rode a bicycle. Well, he also took taxis a lot too, but we won't go into that. But anyway, as Juliette Shaw has said, it's for him it was important, the notion of this natural integration. Another theme that was important to Bernard was the question of the plurality of economic forms. Bernard was not dogmatic. He didn't believe in a socialism that would entirely replace capitalism, but rather pluralist forms, more cooperative forms with local currencies, collaborative economy, or other forms of exchange via the internet and other avenues. So he was very attentive to the emergence of these pluralist forms coming from civil society rather than being imposed from above, coming in particular from some of our dictators, benevolent or not. So the ties between science and citizens and the real economy were particularly interesting to him, and he called for new models. So for him, it's important to make the transition to a more cooperative, less competitive world of the future.
Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation. Je suis très heureux de m'adresser à vous maintenant à cette occasion, qui est une belle occasion. J'espère que vous n'êtes pas fatigués.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm very happy to be here with you for this very special day. I hope you're not too tired. I'm going to read a bit of a text. I'm not very good at reading text, but I'm going to do it, so but I don't want to lose track of some of the things I wanted to say. So I've entitled my talk called Living Together Tomorrow, and for a new alliance of economy with ecology and citizens. And when I speak of citizens, I mean world citizens, including in Cameroun and Senegal, Latin America, all of these places where I have lived and have worked. I think today one of our problems is that we have to think more globally. And so in the second part of my talk, I'm going to look at it from the angle of carbon emissions, which really demand global solidarity. And we need to understand this process in order to take action. So how can we live in this globalized world, a very connected world tomorrow? How can we do this while integrating the question of sustainable development, so the New York Agreement and the COP21 agreement? Because some of the really fundamental questions behind those agreements are the questions of the new economy. So if we say we're going to eliminate extreme poverty, and just eliminate poverty altogether would be a good thing, and at the same time have a world with his thinking and some of the values behind economics and their models. Here, I think it's important to keep all of that in mind while as we start to look to a future of low emissions and without poverty. And I don't think we can do this if we don't change the engines of our economy. So the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, there have been great achievements here. 500 million people who are no longer in extreme poverty, and in the past 21 years, many more people have access to drinking water, children saved, less malaria, and we have seen countries begin to emerge from great poverty. But there are nonetheless 1.5 billion who are still in extreme poverty around the world, mostly in Africa and in South Asia. And so we still have this large remainder of poverty and some of the objectives. So there's a huge failure in that sense of the Millennium Goals. And also we have 13 million hectares of forest loss, fish stocks being depleted. So, in terms of emissions, of course, are still growing, of course. So if we take 2000 as the bench year, we saw rises of 33%. And so there's been a deterioration in that sense. And for me, poverty and the environment are the boundaries, the limits of our system. So 33%. So, as I said, so we are facing the limits of our system, and this creates huge tensions which will not go away until we change our means of production. Let's talk about poverty. These are places where emissions are very low, as we just heard from Juliette. And I'll go with that, touch on that quickly. And And there's been a great deal of debate led by Paul Collier, who said that there's the bottom billion, certain countries in terribly difficult conditions. And in the context of growth, it will be very difficult to begin to grow, to jump on the train like some emerging countries. And in there's a certain debate with Andy Sumner, who've said it's not just the bottom billion, but we have a new bottom billion, in fact, because there are a lot more poor people than we say who are in the emerging countries, so where the economies are rising, but there is still terrible poverty there. So it means that between all of those levels of development, we still see extreme poverty. It's an ecosystem that is almost an integral part of even of development. So we say we want to get rid of the extreme poverty, but we need to look at what is producing this extreme poverty and to see what are the connections as well with environmental issues if we want to improve life for everyone. So this ecosystem of poverty is really indissociable, intrinsically tied to the place of the different regions and these chains of value. This position, really, there's certain conditions that increase the likelihood of poverty. So in Africa, we have, Africa, I think, is the example. It's globally the least advanced continent, and yet great growth, 15% growth in the past 15 years. But in spite of that high levels of growth, we know that there will still be more poor people in 2030 because growth is not compensating for that poverty. And so those are huge challenges because it's just unthinkable that Africa can continue in that way, that in 2050 that Africa still be in the same state. So we have to take action, because as we know, with the great population growth in Africa as well, Africans will soon be 1/4 of the global population. So we have some clear challenges to integrate the world economy. And in 2015, with the tripartite agreement, 26 countries, 625 million people, $1 trillion in PIB. This was an idea for having a free trade area for Africa. This is a very interesting idea. It will be difficult to put in place, but it is nonetheless, we have the same kind of problems that, so this is something that's being discussed. So that's already a first step. So how will we get there? But I think, we can look to what other continents are doing and have done. So what are these global challenges tied to growing carbon emissions? And a lot of this growth in emissions is coming from the global south. In fact, countries of this, a 48% increase coming from the global south. And, I can't show a chart, here, but unfortunately we can't show it. But it really shows that between 1990 and 2010, we saw, when we talk about how quickly they grew, and their emissions grew, while developed countries, well, their emissions were stable or even slightly declined in some areas. So if you look at the per capita emissions, well, obviously, this is mechanical. There's an increase in per capita emissions in the global south, whereas we see a slowdown in the industrialized countries. But when we compare this with income, well, that changes everything, because what we see is that the GDP per capita, if you look at the top 10 emissions countries, if we look at you can see that China, highest emissions, which exceeded the US in 2006, but it's in 8th position if you include the income factor per capita. And so so you can see there's a real parallel there. With China, one Chinese person, $7,000 a year income, whereas the U.S., how much? Oh, okay, that was the first. So what you can see is there's an extraordinary parallel. The highest emitting countries, look at the Chinese and their position, and yet 7th or 8th position there because of income, just ahead of Indonesia and India. And in terms of emissions, in the the red curve, you can see the per capita emissions, because in the United States, $53,000 per capita income. So just imagine if you think the top emitter in absolute terms, where each Chinese person consumes like a German consumer. Germans, it's 52 cars per 100 inhabitants. That means 1 in 2 Germans has and uses a car. If you imagine that on a global scale, when the Africans develop and they aspire to have these cars, how many cars is that going to mean? It's unmanageable. It's absolutely unmanageable. And this applies to all processes in the economy that produce, use, and discard. That's our cycle. That's our linear cycle ever since the end of World War II. Slash and burn all over the world. And so the origin of the problems of our times come from that model, which is accelerating this imbalance between Europe, the overconsumption in the developed countries, and the global south, who are selling their resources at lesser cost than the cost of production. And so with this huge dilemma, and it is now transforming, because the Millennium Development Goals are addressing this, In 2035, the geopolitics, I believe, will be completely different, because in 2050 will be very, very different. And so the questions in the Northern Hemisphere are asking ourselves, are we ready for these changes? And it's not easy to think of. If you go to Kenya, you get European, you get your visa. I'm an African, and I can't go to the Netherlands if I don't pay and apply weeks ahead. So there are these extraordinary privileges there that are not even reciprocal. But society is going to be hugely transformed. And so we have to put together a model that not only functions in the field, but is, psychologically understood and accepted as well. Because currently, this is simply not the case. Africa, it's less than 3% of emissions. And yet the emissions have doubled in the past 10 years. If we look at the oil consumption, usually it's nothing, so it's important to really observe what's going on in Africa because, its fossil fuel consumption is on the rise. So imagine China, biggest emissions, and the $7,000 per capita, whereas by 2050 there'll be twice as many Africans as there are if we continue on these growth patterns. So unless we have an adequate response at a global level, the way we act and think, if we don't move away the dogmatisms of a current economy that would try to make us think that it's a natural law, the laws of nature, well, then we are heading for disaster. So these are trends that need to be monitored. Another important aspect of report from the Commission on quality of life. This was a Bundestag study of 2013 that draws a simple parallel. Yes, emissions have fallen, but in fact, we are consuming products that were produced elsewhere. When our emissions dropped by 2% in Europe, producing for us, where we have relocated. In fact, there's a 528% increase in the emissions there. Electric cars that you drive here, clean. You have to look at, how is it produced, and the rare earth materials, and how those are extracted. So producing new electric cars, it doesn't mean that it's that we're answering the problem. It's the entire chain of production, the entire economic value chain that has to be redesigned. For me, this discussion on these limits that we are reaching, these boundaries, is something that's going to have to drive us to integrate new into the way we produce wealth. So, decoupling. Now, this is a word that, people don't like. It's had bad press. We say that we can solve the problem with this decoupling process. But for me, it's obvious. There's yes, Africans nor in Bangladesh are going to refuse to remain poor, to deny them a certain consumption. In Africa, people are producing, there are women every day creating new things that you're totally unaware of, they have no funding to do this. They don't have access to the technologies but we are beginning to produce things, and they will, with their resources, produce and participate in a real economy. When they reach the stage, when they're really integrated in the economy, not producing at the industrialized levels, they will nonetheless contributing to the process. Well, this changes the situation. So it's important that type of economy, helping those people develop their local economy, must lift people up, and it must be part of this third industrial revolution that we've heard talk of, and so the industrial countries, there has to be some convergence. but I think we need to be ahead of you, in fact, in our production process. Okay, the technologies are in the Northern Hemisphere. The money is in the industrialized countries. But the relationship has to be constructed. Competition, market share. Okay, that's legitimate, but enough to create a society where there's much more decentralized, lateral production, as Jeremy Rifkin calls it. And it's not easy to move away from that diagram, and not to be so maximalist, because it's maximization of profit generally, which of course you can understand to a certain extent, but I think we need to moderate that, change our way of functioning to have a more multiple pluralistic production. We need the classic business model as well, but there has to be more and more collaborative forms, cooperative forms for producing wealth and for the sharing of know-how and knowledge. So amongst the challenges, that is raised for society, well, there are going to be choices have to be made. So there are choices that have to be made now. And so about the Bernard Maris, to whom the UNESCO chair is dedicated, shown the way, a committed citizen committed to a pluralistic economy. And it's not just criticism for the sake of criticism, but rather to propose other ways to run the economy. And and we can see now. I didn't know Bernard Maris the way I knew Jacques Weber and some others, but I can see here, listening to you, I can see how much he was admired and appreciated. And those testimonials are all very touching. And so, from what I've heard, from what I've read, his fight against that conventional forms of the economy is something, he researched and wrote a great deal about, and he practiced it and promoted it for our societies to make them more democratic, and this was a key concern for him, as it is for us. And so, for this economy and societies chair, I think is really the sign that we need to take that thinking even further. And for us, I think we also need to really anticipate the transformation, as Karl Polanyi described. He described the movement of the embedded features of societies. There's a certain, our societies have this capitalistic motor, but the economy is really embedded in social relations. There's a lot going on in the informal economy as well. But there's been a real disconnection at the global scale. So our social relations are now all measured in terms of these conventional economic ideas. And I have lived in places, which really demonstrate this effect. So, for example, with car sharing, collaborative economy, meal sharing, the MOOCs and other things like that. So I think in the West, you really are asking yourselves this question about alternative economies, and it's, I believe there's a future for this. It is growing, but it's not enough yet. It has to be better organized, but there is, certain intrinsic properties to this system that will drive us forward, I believe. So from the African perspective, effective. I see some reactions there. Somebody wants to speak, perhaps. So the UNESCO chair is going to really have to do some, there's going to have to be some fundamental debate. And Juliette mentioned earlier, about, whereas the environment was considered something external, otherness, the otherness of it. And so, and when we see that things aren't functioning, they need to be internalized. And I've seen this in my work on the shared wage system, for example. And so these, the debates around these different economic forms, which are tenacious, they are resilient. In fact, we had been told over and over that these forms couldn't last or couldn't develop, but in fact they're still here. We do have to understand their complexity. We have to understand how they are embedded, and to understand why they still function. So it's resilient. Human resilience is, but capitalism is resilient too, because it continually evolves while staying the same. And so, but we always reach a certain limit, but then there will be a shift in our core. So the systems that we have studied that were considered marginal, and they are also resilient, and they still exist in countries like Cameroon. For example, the land tenure in Thailand and other countries, these systems are still applied by huge swaths of humanity. What about the tontine, the mutual aid systems that have helped millions of women in particular create micro businesses? It's very complex. In fact, then they don't fit the statistics. If we listen to statisticians, this would all have been over and done a long time ago. We would be gone. We would have disappeared. And and I think a lot of the theories have done a lot of damage. Let's look at crowdfunding. I think this is something. If you look at Mauritania, Senegal, people, this is something that's been going on in Africa for a long time. They're financed by the community, and then those who have been financed help finance others. In Harlem, for example, we have there's no goods being exchanged or money being exchanged. It's a system where it's based on trust as well. It's a very modern, advanced form, in fact, trusting each other. Because, signing, a signature is a sign of lack of trust, in fact. And so there are synergies that are possible, but it takes a lot of imagination and inventiveness. And the final point I want to make is that I know I'm running over time. I'm sure there's so much I'd like to say. The question of the circular economy. I mean, this is really what's interesting here. It's an economy. We're much closer to a natural functioning. Okay, there's the mimetism, there's the biological. This is something that, in Africa, this is, we have networks that function that way. And in my studies of the forest, when you look at the way bacteria function, at the roots of the plants to get the phosphorus, to get all the nutrients they need, and the bacteria do this and they feed the plant. And so there's a symbiosis there. And this is something that is very powerful in Africa for the fertilization of our soils. And we've got these centers, these Sanrai centers are models of this circular economy, also called blue economy, but the Seychelles Islands and the European Union. So it's just really this. So it was Gunther Poli who came up with this concept where you can really understand these processes that serve as a foundation to innovate. It's a much less costly, it's much more efficient, and it can really bring people together to find solutions. So I will conclude with that. This circular economy, the symbiosis, really calls local competencies and skills, short circuits, using renewable energies and natural processes rather than chemical processes. In Senegal, we have developed some new processes. The wood, a lot of the waste wood used by industry, we recover. A pencil, a little piece of wood. We recover this, and we can produce something. When people were amazed to see what we're able to do with. I was working with some colleagues, and just one day of training, and people began to produce pens and pencils, and they've taken it all around the world. A very simple system. So imagine, if we can do that with just the waste wood, what can be produced from there, furniture, etc. This is extraordinary, the value chain in the forests. And if you look closely, Africa, it's only 2.8% of the added value of wood. It's less than 3% the added value. So it's the only continent that has a reversed system. We're not producing furniture. They're taking our wood, and we're not doing anything with our wood. So we need to optimize our processes to and also to raise the awareness, and to have more intelligent processes so that people will make the right choices. So those were the main points I wanted to raise, and I thank you again for listening and for your patience. And I look forward to working with you together for a better society for all.